We live in a world ruled by tyranny, where knowledge is suppressed and ignorance is glorified. A world where propaganda and misinformation travel the airways at the speed of lies. But in the midst of the violence and chaos, a great awakening is taking place. And as the media empires continue to collapse, a new network is forming. A network of truth, a network of courage, a network of awareness. Peace and greetings. You are now tuned into the Network of Awareness podcast radio station, where we examine current events, politics, health, finance, and topics of cultural relevance in America and throughout the world, while bringing you insightful interviews with guests that will both educate and inspire you. And now, your host of the Network of Awareness podcast radio station, ORRA the Informationalist.
Nothing like
Please just tell me what's happening to me in plain English without the mumbo jumbo.
my aura is a network full of awareness and gifts like Aura, the informationalist.
How you doing? How you doing?
Yes, peace and greetings, brothers and sisters from around the world. Welcome to the Network of Awareness. I'm your host, owner, and founder of the Network of Awareness, or the Informationalist. And we got a great show lined up with a great guest on the Network of Awareness. And this show is going to be very educational. And we're going to have a guest that is going to share her testimony, share some quality information on how she deals with this busyness that we deal with in life, and making sure that having a sense of urgency in getting things done in our very hectic days, and being well organized to get things accomplished through the spirit of the Most High, and leaving it up the Most High to guide us spiritually. So in just a moment, I'm going to bring on our guest, who, if some of you are watching her on YouTube right now, she goes by Margaret Agard, and she's the author of In His Footsteps. In His Footsteps. And as you can see on the screen there, for those that are watching, she has a website, inhisfootsteps.com. So we're going to talk about her book. We're going to talk about her journey, her walk in this faith, and following the example of Christ, the Messiah, and just, getting to know her a lot better, and really getting an understanding of how to be spirit-led and leaving things to God and letting go, instead of operating in the ego. So, brothers and sisters, this is a Most High Monday episode, and the title of this episode, I had a kind of hard time of figuring out what would be the title of this episode, and it's just letting go and letting God. That's going to be the title, brothers and sisters. Letting go and letting God. And Margaret Agard is really going to educate her on how that simple process, but can be very difficult when we make it so, how it's worked out for her and for her family as well. So with that being said, brothers and sisters, let's not waste any more time and get this show started right, and get this show started quickly. So we're going to bring her on in just a moment, and I'm going to let this beat rock out for just a moment, and then we'll be right back. All right. So welcome. Welcome, Margaret, to the show, to the Network of Awareness, and Grand Rising to you on this Most High Monday. How you doing today?
I'm good. Good to be with you, Orra, and looking forward to it.
So, Margaret, this book that you wrote, which we'll get into. Before we do, I just wanted to have the listeners get to know. I always like to ask my guests kind of like their beginnings, and we can talk about it briefly, like what childhood was like and how your childhood kind of got you, because everybody has aspirations and dreams as a child. And usually our childhood molds us as, when we become adults. And a lot of people say that us as adults, we still have that child in us at all times. And if you can just share what your childhood was like, and then we'll start to discuss where it led you to throughout your life. But the first question in regards to your childhood, what was your upbringing like and your household? Was your household a Christian household, like where your faith is now, or was it something different?
It was Christian, and I grew up, and I think people old enough to remember, a Dick and Jane neighborhood. I lived a block from my grandparents, 3 blocks from my great-grandparents, and the church was across the street from my great-grandparents' house. The school was behind my grandmother's house. And, we had, I don't want to call it a picture of Jesus. It was some kind of like molded Jesus's face. And as you moved around, it looked like his eyes were following. It was kind of funny. And I learned to sing Jesus Loves Me. And I have a recording of my grandmother singing that song, which was fun. And I have to tell you, so hopefully there aren't any little kids listening. I never believed in Santa Claus. I mean, even as a 3-year-old, I thought, well, I don't believe that at all. But I always believed in Jesus. So I just felt a real connection to that.
And when you were being raised with this Christian faith, did you ever go through any challenges throughout your childhood, especially in your teenage years? Because, as teenagers, we become somewhat rebellious, especially towards our parents. Did you experience anything like that? My parents, let me think. So we moved away from that neighborhood that was in Maryland outside of DC up to New Jersey. So my father could start a business when I was about 7 or 8. And then they had a house built. And what I remember is we moved into a new neighborhood. And my first true experience, I say, with God is I was riding my bike around that neighborhood, and it was all new homes. They all looked alike. There was like a little spindly tree. And all of a sudden I realized I was lost and I couldn't find my way home. And I knew I lived near this bridge, and I kept riding on my bike, trying to find that bridge, and so lost. And finally I thought, well, I could go knock on a door because a lot of moms were home then, but I just didn't have the courage to do that. So I actually knelt beside my bike and prayed and said, how do I get home? And I had a thought. And the thought was to go to this one corner, look to my right. And I did. And I saw the bridge. And then I was able to get home. And that was the first time I really felt as if God heard me and answered my prayers. But it took me until I was in my 20s to actually say, I don't really know how to hear your voice. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'd had that experience. I probably had other experiences, but I wasn't putting them together with, this is how you hear that still small voice, until my 20s. In my teenage years, I wasn't a real rebellious kid. I liked feeling good and, having a relationship with God, and my parents felt that way. If anything, I was an oldest daughter, and I sort of got frustrated sometimes. Like, why am I doing all this work? I'm not the one who had all these kids. Do you know what I mean? So right.
I didn't have all these kids. Why am I having to do all this mothering and house cleaning and stuff like that? But I do remember watching my parents do a lot of volunteer work in the church and in the community. And I can remember thinking at some point, why would they do that unless they really believed? That makes sense.
They set a good example for you.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Beautiful. So you have a lot of children.
I do. They set an example that way too.
Yeah.
I have 10 brothers and sisters and 8 children. So yeah.
Yeah. And, when I was reading your bio, let me, cause, usually I will say this in the intro, but I wanted to save it for our conversation. So let me let the listeners know a little bit, about, some of the things that you've been able to accomplish. And one of them is, your family. Now it says here that you have 8 children. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now those are your children, but you also have stepchildren aside from that, or the stepchildren are included in that?
No, 7 stepchildren, but they were never in the house at the same time. By the time my first marriage ended, my husband came out as gay. And then my children were older when I met my second husband, and his children were all out of the house. So it was just my 2 youngest still at home. Yeah.
Okay. And you said that your husband came out as your first husband came out gay, like he said he was gay?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, wow. That must have been a really challenging time to have to go through that. And how long until when you experienced that, and obviously that led to a divorce, I'm assuming. And how long did it take for you to get into another relationship after that?
It's about 3 years from the time we separated until we did.
Now, you as many of my listeners, you have a strong faith in the Most High God and in Christ the Messiah. And
yes.
You mentioned about the prayer when you was a kid, so you obviously evolved in your understanding and your faith in God and knowing that God is real. This thing that you've come to know as far as like giving your to-do list to the Most High God. Let's talk about that, because you've overcome a lot of adversity in your life. And when you and I were talking about how do you turn over your to-do list to God, you talked about a couple of things, but I want the listeners to kind of get an understanding of this, because having one child, I have one daughter. That's all I have. And that was a pretty difficult task to deal with as far as raising one child, especially a girl.
Yes.
And of course, her mother and I weren't even really together throughout the process of raising her. So it was like the courts, visitation, her coming to my house every other weekend, all that stuff. So I can't even imagine how having 8 children, and having to deal with raising them. But you said some of them were out the house already, right? So, but having that many children was a lot to deal with. And I think that that's probably part of what, your to-do list on things to manage and to deal with. So the question that I have for you is like, how did you organize? Like, how did you finally come to that point where you was like, all right, I'm going to give this over to God and start organizing this, this busy lifestyle that you had, where you had to manage a lot of different responsibilities?
At the time, I was supporting the family. So when the marriage ended, I was this financial support for the family. And when the marriage ended, most of the children were still in the house. I think there was one in college and one who was married. The other 6 were still at home. Most were in high school or junior high. I had them all close together. I had 8 and 11 years. And so, which it seemed like a good idea until we had 5 teenagers at once. They were like, well, probably should have thought that through better. But, what I was trying to do was keep up my job. And when you're an executive in the high tech industry, there's some pressure. And then I had decided to finish my degree because I had about 2 semesters left to finish. And a lot of companies were going public and you needed some credentials. And as an executive, I wanted to get that credential in. And I had the children at home, the 6 children, getting them to sports and back from sports and part-time jobs. And so it was overwhelming. I was getting about 4 hours sleep a night, going to bed about midnight, getting up about 4. And then I didn't sleep well because I would wake up in the middle of the night, frantic, like, what have I forgotten to do? What have I forgotten to do? And it seemed for a while as if I would do things and it would turn out to be the thing that didn't need to be done. that I thought. I knew how to set priorities. And so one of the things I did was step down as an executive and start a consulting business, which gave me a lot more freedom. But even then, I would show up, say, with a client I was consulting with. I would have worked a few hours on some project, which they said they wanted. And when I came in, they would completely change the specifications. And I think, I could have not spent those hours. And this was back before we did an online school. A few places were starting it, but mostly you had to walk in to take a test. You had to walk in to hand in a paper. And I can remember going in to see a note on the door that said, "Oh, the professor's sick. You will collect your papers on Friday instead of Tuesday." And I'd be thinking, well, if I'd known that, there were other things I could have done last night. Do you know what I mean? And That's what I kept thinking. God, if I'd just known what was coming, I would have planned differently. And then I started thinking, well, I know who does know, and that's God. God knows the future. So I thought, I'm just going to ask him, what do I have to do today? And I always had a to-do list. And I'm one of those to-do list type people that if I did something that wasn't on the list, I wrote it on the list so I could cross it off. So I'm talking to people like that. I'm really into my to-do list. And so here's how I turned my life over to God. I turned my to-do list over to God. And then I just did what was on the list and let go of worrying about anything else. And I would just take my list. I would write it all down. First I did it in the morning, but then I started doing it at night because I would think about it overnight. And so it was good to only be thinking about what God had on the list. So the last thing I did before I went to bed was make my to-do list for the next day.
Can you share some of the significant changes that you started to see in your life once you started doing that?
I gave up a lot of things that turned out didn't matter. And in fact, there was a strong thought as I did it, don't add to this list. Don't add to this list. Because if you're a type A personality and you think you have a couple hours ahead, you're going to try to come up with something to put in to that couple of hours. Don't add to the list. And so when I started doing that, I was finished every night by about 8. I could just sit back and relax and not worry, have time to talk to my children, be in bed at a decent hour. I still was getting up around 4:30, but I was getting more sleep. But especially I didn't wake up in the middle of the night in any kind of panic thinking, what have I left undone? Because I knew it was in good hands.
Absolutely. Now, you worked for a big tech company. What was the big tech company that you worked for, and what did you do for them?
I worked for a software company. It was one of the top 50 at the time. This has been 30 years. And it was called Timberline Software. It's since been purchased by Sage. So it's just one of those standard things. They went public. They got bought by someone else. And at the time, I first started working for them, not working for them, but I was in a dealership with them. They sold their software to construction companies, high-end and medium construction companies through a dealer channel. And I eventually went to work directly for them, handling the one of the 4 regional dealer channels. And then I just had to travel a lot and work with the dealers and help them, increase their sales. And as a dealer, I was one of the top 10. They had an international dealer channel, and I was one of the top 10 for the world, I guess.
Based on my own personal experiences, were you happy that you left that behind and went into consulting instead and had more free time to do other things?
I did. Yes, it absolutely freed up my time. Of course, on the other hand, I had to worry about bringing in the income.
Right.
And, it was one of those things where sometimes I'd be looking at it thinking, who can I collect an invoice from? Then I'm driving over, can I pick the check up today? So that was interesting.
Yeah, that seems to always be the challenge too, when you leave a company and go on your own.
Yeah. And then actually I went back to work for a company after I finished my degree. But this was such a much easier company to work for. But I do remember in the interviews, some of the employees, because sometimes I'll have your peers interview you. So there's the upper management and then the peers. And they were like, why would you give up having your own business? And I thought, well, apparently you've never had to collect payroll checks so that you can make payroll. But I liked just focusing, on what I like to do and not worry about all the management side, which was nice when I did go back to work for a company after I had my degree and my kids were older. But again, I couldn't travel, which limits what level of management you can work at.
Can you talk a little bit about, what the experience was like of building your business around your purpose? And can you let the listeners know what that purpose is?
Well, for me, my purpose is sharing this information about you can go to God and he will direct your life and bring you to whatever your purpose is. And my purpose has turned out to be writing books about my relationship with God and where he's taken me and the literal, I want to say day-to-day minutia, the kinds of things that, I write about what it was like when I had this 15-year-old who was just the most obnoxious kid and critical and demanding and thought so much of himself. He was 6'4" and he lettered in 3 sports. And I can remember going to God saying, boy, I love him because he's my son, but I don't like him much. And God was like, I want you to pray.
I felt like that about my daughter, by the way. So you're not alone.
So help me to see him as you see him. That's the prayer God gave me to pray. And I started praying that prayer. And as I did, I can remember going to my mom's and, she still had magazines and I'm looking through her stack of magazines. And there's one, I don't know what it was, some women's magazine, flipping through looking for a story to read. And there was one about a school where a boy had accused a favorite coach of sexually abusing him. Mm. And he had been pilloried for that. And I thought, we just had something like that in our school. And as I read it, I realized, it's talking about our school where my 15-year-old son went. Wow. And then as I read along, it said this. It said, the only thing he kept going, he was actually became, suicidal and depressed because how was it being treated at school? And he said the only thing he had that kept him going was a petition that had been signed by a few students that basically said, we're on your side. And his parents had framed it and it was on his bedside stand. And as soon as I read those words, I remembered the day I dropped my 15-year-old son off at school. And he said to me, I'm going to go in and ask to pass this petition around to make sure this kid knows he's not alone, that we're here for him.
Wow.
And remember, my son was popular. He was, lettering in 3 sports. And when I went to pick him up that afternoon, I said, how'd it go? And he was mad. He said they wouldn't let me pass it around. They said we weren't talking about this at school anymore. This was a case for the courts. And so they wouldn't let him. So he said, I just went to a few of my friends and we signed it and gave it to him. And, I'd totally forgotten about that. And I had no idea. If I hadn't read that article, I would not have known the impact it had on that young man. And that's when God said, here's who I see. Here's who I see.
Wow. Powerful story there. I just covered a story yesterday about a Canadian 16-year-old that has been chastised, arrested twice in one day, and lost 22 credits that he had in high school because he stood up for the girls that were complaining about boys using the bathroom. They were claiming to be transgender. So it's amazing. It was in Canada. Yeah. And think about this. It was a Catholic school. Out of all the schools, you would think the Catholic school would not be in favor of this, but yet they're chastising this young man because he wants to stand up for his religious beliefs and in his understanding of the word that, certain things are considered an abomination. Yeah. Quite a story. But with that being said, let's talk about, you're an award-winning author. So let's talk about this book, in his footsteps. You also then I also want to go into the memoir, but what compelled you, spiritually to want to become an author and start writing books?
Again, it was part of that being led with my to-do list. What do you want me to do today, God? It changed from what do I need to do today, God, which was like, just help me get through this day, to what do you want me to do today, God? And at one night, he was like, I want you to start writing your life on the internet. Now, this was back around, I'm trying to think, it was around 98, 99, before, I don't even think WordPress was out then. And blogs weren't really popular. I was trying to figure out how to do it. I did have a website because we were selling some products online, but I wasn't sure how to do it. And so finally I said, I don't know how to do this. So I need a little help. And I found this site called Open Diary, which still exists. And you could put a private diary up there and just share it with people who belong to Open Diary. I began to write just what was happening. Things like that story. I just wrote it. And after, a couple of years, I had this thought, I want you to make a book from this. And initially, what I tried to do was the way really people who write memoirs, they refer to their journals, but you don't put the journal in. You want to make it a little better, one hopes. But it was like, no, you've already written it. Just pull certain stories out and put them into this book. And that's became the first book I wrote, which is In His Footsteps. I gave my to-do list to God, got more done, more sleep, and less stress. And I just tell stories in there. I think of it as my own chicken soup for the soul book, like the story about what happened with my 15-year-old and what I learned from that, or about how I met my second husband, which I say is God's sense of irony. And I also tell how I learned to hear that voice. And that became the book. But both times it was a thought when I was saying, what do you want me to do? And sometimes it's a daily thing. I want you to call this person. Other times it's a much larger project in which I'm often saying, I don't have a clue. And then I have to walk through the steps, or I'll meet people. I'll find something that helps me figure out how to do it. Maybe the way you did your show, or I don't know.
Okay. I have an episode I did a while back in season 5, which we're still on. This is you're part of. It's called Great Understandings. Okay. That's the whole theme for season 5. And obviously you're a great guest for Great Understandings, because your great understandings of the Most High in you, that spirit that you come from, you led you to this, this journey of some beautiful things that have happened for you. I have this episode called Even When It's Bad, It's Still All Good. And I want to talk about that because you mentioned something that's in your book about the irony of how you met your second husband. And something I talk a lot about because I've had some bad relationships. I had one that was extremely horrible last year with a narcissist that I talk a lot about in my series. I have a whole narcissism series because I feel like, even though I'm not a psychologist, I feel like I'm a guru on narcissism because I dealt with it at a very, very high level. From multiple people throughout my life, but especially last year, it was horrible. But with that being said, you said there was an irony in this, and I tend to find that even when it's bad, it's still all good, because even when those demonic, satanic, evil forces are attacking us spiritually, the Most High has a way of being in control of everything. So certain things are allowed in order for you to learn and grow from. So you have to go through that trial by fire, so to speak. Like, you have to just go through those hard times. But even though you go through those hard times, it's still all good in the spirit of the Most High and Christ, because, Christ gave the example. Who had it harder than Christ? You know what I mean? Right. With all that he had to endure, right? So when we're in that spirit, we get tested. Our faith gets tested. It's like, how are we going to really know if we're truly faithful if we don't get tested and see if, hey, are you really about this life? Are you really about this faith? Do you truly love me? Do you truly want to be or walk in the path towards salvation? Or are you just pretending? And there's a lot of pretenders. And that's where you see where the pressure goes on, they fail. They fall to the wayside and go into the world, become more worldly instead of being more godly in their faith. You mentioned about the irony. And the reason I asked this question about the irony about meeting your second husband is you had a situation where you found out, that your husband was gay. I mean, that must have been extremely traumatizing for you.
The marriage was traumatizing until I realized he really is gay, because, I wasn't unattractive. I mean, I'm quite a bit older now and heavier, but it wasn't unattractive. And other men acted attracted to me, but he did not. People are like, well, I know, but you've got 8 kids. I'm like, well, how many times do you have to have sex to get 8 kids? Like that, right? But I feel one of us was interested and the other was accommodating. We'll put it that way. Yeah. So there was always a sense that I wasn't acceptable. But anyway, that it was not. So, it's over now. So what happened after the marriage ended? Yeah. So a couple of years after it ended, I thought, I don't think I want to date. And I thought, I don't want to get married again though, because I still had teenage sons at home and I thought that'd be a mess. And so I can remember at the time what you did was look through newspapers, right? They had a personal section where you could find someone. And I thought, well, I'm just going to date someone I would never marry. That's how I felt. I should date people who don't believe in God, like that, right? Like that's where I'm headed, because unfortunately I have a degree in math and I sometimes think more like a computer than a person. And so that was my solution. And I did actually set up a couple of dates, and God both times said to me, you should not, don't do this. And then things happened that the dates great didn't happen. Like one guy's car broke down. And I thought, And so then he said, you're going to meet, this was in the spring, you're going to meet the man you're going to marry next fall. And I thought, my gosh, I don't want to get married again. And that's the whole point. Like, no, thank you. But I did meet, and here's how I met him. What I was trying to do was help my oldest son, who was 26 at the time and who wanted to marry. And he was going to leave the area and go like 2,000 miles away and start his life over again. And there he'd meet the woman of his dreams, right? And I'm like, yeah, but then we'll never see you again because you won't be living near us. You'll be living near her family and we won't ever get to see you. And so I tried to get him to go on this like site for church people who want to meet singles. Well, this was in 96, and you had to throw the net far and wide to get anyone to pop up, like plus or minus 10 years my age, the whole United States to get someone to pop up. And so he didn't do it, but I had put up a profile to show him how to do it. Like here, I put my profile up, do it like this. And one of the responses to my thing turned out to be this man Parker, who lived 2,000 miles away. And my son went out 2,000 miles away and he meets a girl we lived in, the DC area. He met a girl whose family lived in Pennsylvania. So they settled in Maryland because they were near her family and our family. And I ended up marrying this guy and moving 2,000 miles away. That's what really happened. I'm like, funny one, God. So then at the time I was still consulting. So we were able to go back and forth across the country. It's like, here I was so worried he'd meet someone who lived 2,000 miles away. Instead I did. So
how did that, obviously you're still with this man to this present day.
Parker. Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. So it's been, that was the blessing, right? Like you went through this one marriage that was, I don't want to say it was a sham, but to a certain degree it was, right? Because he really wasn't, he really didn't have the interest that a man should have in a woman, but it wound up turning out better. Like, so you wound up getting the blessing of going through that trial by fire and going through those, that lie, and then finding some truth in the next relationship. And based on what you experienced in the past, did you get to appreciate your relationship and your marriage with Parker more because of what you went through?
I think so, but I should say right off the bat that if this was a match made in heaven, it didn't look really good at first because he came from the background where he had an abusive alcoholic father. He was very controlling. And the difference was he was very willing to talk about what he was upset about, where my first husband was, we went to counseling and they said, well, he's passive aggressive and he's not willing to tell you. He'll just do mean things. And my first husband had no interest in supporting the family, which is why I ended up doing it. But Parker, on the other hand, takes that on because I'll make sure we get cared for. But, in return, he expected, I'm not sure what he expected, but let me say he didn't expect me. He didn't expect a woman who was used to being in charge herself. And we worked things out is what it came down to. In fact, at one point I thought, it's not like we have children together. Like should I even stay in this marriage? And again, I had an answer from God. And I said, I just need something to hold on to because it's feeling very painful, not only for myself, but for my children, because now I'm so far away.
Right.
He gave me, I said, I just need a verse. You know how sometimes you just ask for a verse that you can say to yourself every time you're struggling. And so I asked for a verse, but instead of a verse, I got this promise: all will be made whole as a result of this marriage. And the Bible, when Christ says, thy faith hath made thee whole, like he says to the woman who touched, who had the issue of blood and she touched his garment, right. Or when he says to the one leper who came back to thank him, he told the others they were healed, go see the people, right? Go see the priests. And so they all 10 left. Only one came back and thanked him. And he said to him that same word, thy faith hath made thee whole. And when I looked up whatever the Greek or the Aramaic or whatever it was in the New Testament, that word whole is referring to a spiritual and emotional healing, not just physical healing. And I wanted that. So whatever it would take, I was willing to do the work. And that's what the third book is about: how I met him, what things look like, and how we actually reached that point of healing for both of us and for our children.
Wow. All praises for that. All praises for that. And there's, what's that one prayer that can improve almost any relationship that we were going to talk about? Can you let the people know what that one prayer is?
Well, that prayer was the one I prayed over my 15-year-old. Help me to see this person as you do, and help me to understand this person as you do. And we've added to that, help me to love this person as you do, because understanding doesn't always give us that love for it. And I had a radio show for a while. It's been about 10 years. And I can remember asking my listeners to pray the same prayer about someone they were struggling with and tell me what happened. And they did. I can remember one woman said they lived in West Virginia, and she did a big garden. She and her husband were getting old and getting disabled, but they would get out. I mean, sometimes they would actually kind of crawl around their garden. And they had always been able to use her aunt's property next door to plant a garden too. And then her aunt said, no, can't use my property anymore. And she was upset. Like, she didn't even want to talk to her aunt. And after she prayed that prayer, her aunt called one night, wanted to share some family stories and history. And so they talked for a while. She said, why won't you let us use your garden spot? Like, what happened there? And she said, it's killing me to watch you all try to garden, the garden you already have, with your canes and your walkers and crawling. So I just couldn't watch it anymore. So I said, no, you can't use mine. So it really changed her attitude toward her aunt. So that prayer, you never know. You never know where it's going to lead. Sometimes it says, well, yeah, that person is abusive. Get away. You might be in that situation.
Yeah. And I had that situation last year where it's like you just certain people you got to get away from as far as possible because they're just toxic. So how do you know, like for me, before I ask you this question, for me, the way the Most High God speaks to me is through people and situations that I'm put in. It's like the message is revealed to me through the scenario that I'm currently involved in, and the way things are very synchronistic and the way they play out. It could be from an animal doing something to a person saying something, from something popping up at the TV. And it's just this synchronicity of these events that happen that's giving me this message. And a lot of times it'll be something that somebody says to me that the Most High has put this person in my life for that particular reason. It could be for a very brief moment, or it could be for a long period of time, depending on the situation or the message that is being given and the lessons that I need to learn in order to move forward with my life and some of the challenges that I'm dealing with. So for you, I know this is one of the questions that you have is like, how do you know when God is speaking to you specifically, and how does that happen for you?
So first, let me respond to what you just said, which is often I am put in a situation where I'm learning kind of a bigger lesson, but on the day-to-day thing, what do I need to do today? Or maybe when I'm riding around, I have learned to recognize that, what I call that still small voice. I've learned to recognize the prompting. And of course, like most people, I'm like, well, is this a prompting from God, or is this just my ADHD speaking? So when I began in my 20s, I said, I don't know when I'm hearing your voice. Now, remember, I'd had a prayer answered when I was in second grade, lost on my bike. But I just wasn't able to discern what thought in my head was God versus what thought was just my brain going crazy. And so I prayed that prayer, help me to learn to hear your voice. And as a result, I had some experiences where people actually said to me when I followed through on a thought I had in my head that, I've been praying for this. So that helped me to begin to discern the difference. And often what happens is I'll have a thought. Like the first time it happened, I was making a big pot of chili, and it was big. It turned out to be bigger than I thought. I had to get a big pan out to make it. And the thought came, it was on a Monday, invite these people to dinner tonight, some friends. And I thought, no, they just came to dinner Friday night. That'd be crazy. So I just kept, cooking. And I thought, again, I think it's me, right? The thought comes again, invite this family to dinner. And again, I thought, no, tonight we've planned some special activities with our children, and we're going to talk to them about tithing and stuff. And so the thought came a third time, invite this family to dinner, invite them to stay for tithing talk. And, maybe this is God. So I thought, maybe this is God. So I did call and invite them, and they did come to dinner. And then we were doing the little tithing lesson with our kids. And, this couple was the same age as us. So they had a couple of kids, and they were in the lesson too. And then they they said to us, we wanted to pay our tithing. In fact, we wanted to catch up. Now, I never recommend catching up. Just start and move ahead, right? But in their case, they had gotten a big check in because he kind of worked for a company on bonuses and stuff. And they had enough to pay all of their tithing. Or if they didn't pay all their tithing, they could also buy food, but they couldn't do both. And they thought about it a long time and they decided we're just going to pay tithing. And they went to church on Sunday. And by the end of church, they had invitations to dinner every night for the next week, except one night, Monday night. And so I invited them. So that's when I started to think, oh, this is how I hear God in my heart. This is what his voice sounds like. And I had a couple more experiences that same week. So what I'm going to say about that is the thought comes. It's a good thought. And if I blow it off, it comes back. And it'll come back like 3 or 4 times. And so when it keeps coming back and I think, oh, wait, this is not me. I'm thinking it because it's God. And sometimes in the middle of it, I'll say, is this you? I can remember driving home once from I was visiting one friend, and I was driving past this little A-frame cabin motel spot. And, I knew the woman who ran it because she went to our church, but I didn't know her. You know what I mean? I just kind of waved at her in the hall, that kind of thing. And the thought came, stop and see her. And I thought, I don't really know her. And most people don't like you knocking on their doors these days, just show up. But it was like, stop and see her. And so I was like, is this you? And so I pulled into her parking lot and knocked on her office door. And she looked surprised to see me. And she also looked unhappy. And I was just kind of looking at her. And finally she said, well, come on in. And then sat down and then just unloaded her heart to me. Her son had gotten involved in drugs. He was a couple of states away. He'd been in jail. They'd released him, late at night. He had no money. And she said, they're concerned about how to take care of him. And she said, it's like he's killing himself with drugs. And then she said, if my son had leukemia, everyone in the church would be over here with casseroles and how can we help you? But he's killing himself with drugs and no one's here for me. And so I guess I was the one who was here for her.
Wow. Yeah. It's sad that, that they look at somebody who has leukemia, but somebody struggling with addiction completely different when the suffering is suffering, no matter in what form it's coming in.
Well, especially for the parents, the parents were like, oh.
Right. Absolutely. In his footsteps, right? If there's one thing that you could tell the listeners on why they should read this book and what, one thing that you can specifically say that if they were to read this book that they would get from it. And as far as when, if they were to read this book, like what is one thing you can say that they can really take from reading this book in his footsteps?
What people tell me is the book makes them feel good and it gives them hope. And that they can read it in small snippets. You don't have to sit down and try to read the whole book because it is written with short stories like the ones I've just shared with you.
Right.
And then I prayed and this happened, or then I felt this prompting and this happened. So that's the good thing about it. That's also kind of the bad thing about it because there's no I must turn the next page to find out what's happening. But and for most people who read it, they will say, this is the relationship I want with God. And so this is how I say I do it. I just say, what do you want me to do today, God?
Wonderful. Now you are working currently, if I'm correct, on a memoir, right?
The third memoir. Yes.
The third memoir. What are the first 2 memoirs? If you can share that with the audience.
Well, that's a memoir. The one is In His Footsteps. I gave my to-do list to God is a memoir, basically, because I'm just sharing what happened to me. And a memoir is not an autobiography. A memoir is a slice of your life. And so that slice of my life is my relationship with God and how he directed me. And actually at the end of the book, I have to tell you, or if you ask most Christians, does God love you? They're like, yep, God loves me. And that's all up in their head. I mean, they know that's the right answer, right? And most of us feel like, well, I'm pretty sure God loves those person, but me, maybe not so much. I'm not good enough, right? And so what I really got from all the places he sent me, all the people I helped, was he loves us so much. I never felt condemnation from him for anyone I was visiting, even if I personally was thinking, well, of course you ended up like this. You're buying drugs and you let that abusive guy back into your life, even though the police took him away twice. That would be how I react. That is not how God reacts. God is like, you need to look deeper and I'm there for you. And so by the end of that book, I know how much God loves me in my heart. And that's what I would want for people, that it's not in your head, it's in your heart. I had no idea where I was heading this. Okay, so that's what the first book is. And the third book, the second one was we went and we served missions, and I very similar, but more of a time frame. And then the third one is about Parker. And, those two promises I had, that I would meet someone I would marry. And then the fact that it wasn't looking like a match made in heaven, and that this marriage would be healing to both of us. And then the arc of how we got from that promise to today, where it has been healing. When I asked my children and his children, was this healing in any way to you? They're like, oh yeah, let me tell you. So it accomplished so much. And it was such hard work, because you know what they call the work, where you have to change the way you think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I have titles like The 3-Day Mad and Is It Me, God? And We Are a Genius and I Need Compliments. And so this whole kind of arc until there is healing for both of us.
Yeah. And that's the work that never ends too. Changing the way we think.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yes.
Especially spiritually, like you got to get rid of the old woman or the old man of you, like the person that you used to be, and recreate yourself through that spirit of Christ, to where now you're not just managing your time differently and how you deal with life, but really on how you deal with people and how, how you respond to people, how you judge people, because one of my favorite chapters is the chapter in Matthew, which is the 7th chapter, which I was just going over in a class. It was like, we can't be judging each other. And when we're not correct, you know what I mean? When we have errors in our lives and we become, and I think here in American society and Western civilization, we've become very critical of each other. That's a big problem. But something where, what you were saying about changing like our hearts, which is in scriptures, our minds, because that's really where all the sin begins, is that pride of those thoughts where you start thinking that you're a God, which comes from the ego, and I talk about it on my show about edging, ego standing for edging God out. Once you edge God out, you're living in the ego. You're fully embracing something that eventually is going to lead you to self-destruction. Guaranteed.
Right.
There's
absolutely
no other way around it. It's going to lead you to self-destruction. And we see it all the time here in America, especially, where everybody that's operating the ego winds up falling to their demise based on the fact that they've edged God out of their life. That's why you see all these celebrities being big-time drug addicts. Sometimes they commit suicide and all that. Because they're venerators of themselves, and they love that self-worship.
They don't know how to fill that hole in their heart that is really the place for God.
Right.
Yeah. I remember having that same thought. That anytime I want something more than to be true to God and His teachings, that's when I'm going to end up in trouble.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then especially like even with me right now, the never-ending struggle, or I shouldn't call it a struggle, but it is a process, and it can be struggling at times because you're battling that old self to the new self that's walking in the example of Christ's teachings within the scriptures. And I battle with that sometimes because, we want to deal with people differently. And something that I dealt with recently is having more compassion, because sometimes it's hard for me to deal with people that are ugly spiritually, and I have to show them love. Yes. Yeah. Like that, not be so, oh, you're wrong. And, and kind of just judging them for that, and really trying to see the God within them, because we all come from the Most High, right? We were all created in His image. And sometimes it's hard for me to see that image in other people that may not be that pleasant to deal with.
So I've had those experiences because we live in the country, and we live in the type of country where people go to hide out. They're trying to live on their disability check, so it's cheap. They've got, chain link fences and dogs, and you are the Rottweiler, and, we shoot first, ask questions later. And we spend a lot of time with people who are just, oh my gosh, such a mess. This is kind of how I would look at it. And I can remember having to take a woman, not having to because I offered to do it, to one of her doctor appointments, because usually they don't have cars or the cars are broken. Something's going on. Always a crisis. And I can remember having a hard time really connecting to her with love, with my heart. And I said to God, I'm at a loss. And he said, Margaret, you don't have to fix these people, because that's always how it felt like as an oldest daughter, with 9 younger brothers and sisters is, I've been told from the time I was tiny, why did you let him do that? And you were responsible and this happened. And I guess I was bringing that into the relationship. And I knew that, it takes a long time, decades for people to change. I knew we were going to be helping this woman for a long, long time. And it can just feel overwhelming. But the minute I had that thought, it's not your job to fix this woman, I relaxed. And I thought, yeah, it's not my job. I can just enjoy her for who she is. And I did have some compassion. I think what was stopping me was this idea that I was going to have to clean up after her and the problems she caused for herself. And then a couple months later, I can remember having this thought about we use the word broken a lot today. It's big. It's a big word to say. Oh, they're broken. Right. And so God said to me, Margaret, my children aren't broken. None of my children are broken. They're spiritually wounded and they're struggling, and I can heal that, but they aren't broken. Stop thinking of them like that. And then he said, I have given everyone a gift, not just the good people, not just the ones who came from good backgrounds. And I want you to start paying attention to these people and find out the gift I gave them and let them offer it to you, to share it with you. Has completely changed and I'm in my 70s. So I'm like, I've been doing this for decades, hauling people to the doctor and going in and trying to shore up their broken floors. We're talking about people who, we went in once and spent like 3 or 4 months. We try to help people help themselves, not do it for them. And, they had rats and cockroaches, and for whatever reason. And, once she was upset about a rat and tried to shoot it and ended up shooting out her oven door, which you have to be like, now what? And so we actually helped this one woman and her son get their place cleaned up. And then we go into another woman's house and it's the same way. She had laundry piled up and rats and cockroaches. And I was like, I don't know if I'm up for this again. And then I have to tell you, I'm really a bad person, because their house burned down and they all got out. Everybody got out. Nobody got hurt. But it wasn't my first thought. It was my second thought was, well, I guess that took care of the rats and the cockroaches, but not to go through life. But they, they're in a decent place now. Things have worked out. And, we helped as much as we could, but I have no idea why I started that, but to tell you that these people also have gifts. They aren't broken. And I know their gifts and I learn from them. And I often say to them, that was a gift to me.
You said you're in your 70s, and so is my mom. My mom, I think, just turned 75 or 74. I forget. But
good Lord. I bet she knows how old you are. Okay.
She forgets too.
Okay, that's good.
I think my whole family forgets my birthdays these days, but that's okay. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
What matters is that I wake up in the morning. That's like, that I get to live another day to make it to another year. But my question to you is, now, that you're in your 70s, you've actually, you've lived many decades on this place called Earth. And you grew up in I call it the United Shenanigans of America, but we'll call it the United States of America for now. Growing up in the U.S., can you share with the audience your perception of where you see society now opposed to the America that you grew up in?
I think we've tried a lot of new things. And what's been good is more and more people look at it and say, that didn't work very well. I grew up as a teenager, early 20s in the whole free love movement with, we should make divorce easier because then women won't be stuck in these abusive marriages. We need to help women get better jobs so they aren't dependent on a man. And that's not the problem, because I know more than one woman who is not married to an abusive man, and she's providing all the financial support and he's in the house. So I'm like, okay, so that didn't help. But what would help is God. And you know what? The best thing that happened was the pandemic. People were
Yes.
like, oh my gosh, if things get tight, people are going to come out and be roving bands with guns, taking our food away. And I'd be like, I'll just give it to them. They don't have to kill me. They can have it. And that's what I saw happening all over the world. People reached out to help each other. People are basically good. That's what I see. People are basically good and they will help each other. And that hasn't changed.
Yeah, the pandemic, I was just having this conversation with a couple of brothers and sisters, and the pandemic did change a lot. Some for the good and some for bad. It's really, right. But I think what it really did, especially here in the U.S., but around the world, I think it exposed the level of intelligence and of people, as well as their lack of critical thinking skills. And also, I think what it did too is that it exposed people spiritually. And what I mean by that is that you had a lot of Christians that said that they're faithful to Christ, that they're faithful to the Most High. But when the pandemic hit, it was so far from the truth. It's like we got to see a lot of people's true colors based on their faith being tested by the pandemic. And then we got to see people, which I find it's just like, it's crazy how people who you would have thought, they're not really about that life. They're not good. They're not faithful. Those are the people that were like shocking everybody. Like, right. Oh, they are faithful. Boy, was I wrong.
Right.
Those are the people. That's what from my personal experiences, that's what I've seen with the pandemic. And it's been a beautiful thing to experience. So like with that being said, let's kind of draw to the end of this interview and broadcast. And I want to kind of just pick your brain as to what would you suggest, especially to these younger people that seem to get overwhelmed by life. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. 90s as a teenager and in the 80s, obviously, as a kid. And now I'm 45 years old. I don't get overwhelmed. Like, when the pressure's on, I excel. I'm like, bring it. I'm going to speed it up. Whatever it is, I'm going to turn myself up and make it happen, regardless of whatever the situation is. Have I gotten lax with certain situations in my life? Absolutely. But when it comes to handling certain things, when it comes to our jobs, I noticed that the younger generation, they get overwhelmed with like the most frivolous things, especially with their jobs. Like I've seen it, like even like if I go to like a Dunkin' Donuts or a restaurant where there's young people working and it gets a little busy in the line, and it's almost like they don't know what to do with themselves. This younger generation, they get so overwhelmed when the heat is on or when the pressure's on, and it's not even that much pressure. Like I even tell my daughter, like, this is nothing. Like these kids being depressed at such young ages too. It's like, what do you know about depression? Yeah. Like, you know what I'm saying? Your life is good. So my question to you is, what would be your advice to all of the young men or the soon to be men and women, but the younger people in this society and American culture that gets so easily overwhelmed? What would be some good advice that you can give them to let them know how they should be looking at their life and the circumstances that they create for themselves and that they're put in?
I usually just say, because I have grandkids, the age you're talking about, it's take a deep breath, do the one thing, just do one thing. Because if you say do the most important thing, they're like, but I don't know what is most important. It's like, no, just do the one thing. Like if you're in a line that just got busy, take care of the customer in front of you, take a deep breath, stop worrying about the rest of it. You know what I mean? Just do the one thing. And it'll all work out.
And that's good advice.
I know that seems pretty simple, but let's do that.
Well, that's the thing, is that we complicate things. I think that these kids are complicating situations that are very simple. One thing I've learned is in studying scriptures and just understanding the spirit of God that is in everything. I always say that the Most High is that which is and always will be. It's that everlasting light that we are created in that image. Yeah. And we put into these physical forms, because we're spiritual beings having a physical experience temporarily until we leave these bodies again. And we're going back into that, not even going back, but we become only that very essence in which we are, in which we were created, in, which is God's. So what I've realized is that this thing called life and the way God intended it for us is very simple. I truly believe that God works in simplicity, not in complexity, because life is not really, I think that Satan works in complexity. I think Satan complicates things to where we start second guessing ourselves. And that's where the doubt comes in. And where does doubt come from? Fear. And that the wickedness and the evilness thrives in fear, because when you're living in fear, you're not really in that spirit of Christ. Because as much as Christ was tempted, or should I say was tested, he never lost his faith, and he was never fearful. It was always faith over the fear, you know?
That's
so
interesting that you mentioned that simplicity. You said, you know, like, how did my life change when I started turning my to-do list over to God? And I would say those are the perfect words, Orra. He simplified it. He took everything out that wasn't really of the highest good and left the rest. And that's basically what we're saying when we say to young people who are overwhelmed, stop, take a deep breath, just do the one thing that's right in front of you to do.
Absolutely. Okay. So, people, definitely get, Margaret's book or memoirs too, and I'm going to have the link in the description in hisfootsteps.com. So definitely click on the link to get the information and to get the books. Also too, any final comments or words that you want to leave the listeners with, and you can take as long as you want, by the way. It doesn't have to be like a one sentence thing. Just any final comments, thoughts, to conclude this, episode on letting go and letting God, which I think you did a great job in giving people a greater understanding of what that means.
Or I just wish I'd done it sooner. And, what I shared, how to just turn your life over by turning your to-do list over. And most of us, we don't all write it down, but it's in our heads, has just been life-changing to me. And what I know is God loves us and wants to bless us. Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Margaret. And I'm going to close this episode. I want to thank you. You did an awesome job on the Network of Awareness. Thanks. And I greatly appreciate, your time and your energy and your spirit and educating brothers and sisters in this faith and in this life that, we only get one chance to do it, so we got to make the most of it, and we got to educate ourselves and really really be able to be honest with ourselves. I think that's an important thing too, is really being honest with ourselves. And a lot of times when we're honest with ourselves, we're going to find out things or be honest about things that are not that good. And we're going to have to not care about what other people think about that, because that's all about, growing and transforming into a better person and being, becoming better examples of that walk that Christ led or that Christ lived, that life. So, let's get this music going here for the outro here. So, brothers and sisters, I'm going to have the link in the description box. Definitely, check out Margaret's book. It's worth reading, especially if you're somebody that is overwhelmed with a bunch of different responsibilities throughout your day. This is a good book to read, because now you can get better organized and put your to-do list and leave it in God's hands and start, properly organizing your days in advance, so that way you don't get overwhelmed, especially you young people that are listening, because I know that many of you young people, and I can tell you that just by having this episode with you, I learned a lot of things that's going to help me better organize my busy schedule as well. So with that being said, brothers and sisters, want to thank you for tuning into this episode of season 5, Great Understandings. And this is actually episode 68, because we did a bonus episode yesterday. But letting go and letting God. That's the topic of discussion for today with Margaret Agard, the author, the award-winning author of In His Footsteps. So when you live in the present, there is always an opportunity for a new beginning. And don't look for the light at the end of the tunnel, because the light is and always will be within you. So light up the tunnel and find your way through the darkness, brothers and sisters. This is Orra the Informationalist, saying peace, love, and light, and all praises to the Most High in Christ. Shalom.